Good morning. I'm going to talk for about 20 minutes and then take any questions. And I will tell you a bit more about myself because there's a slide about me. So what am I going to cover? A bit more about me, as promised. The most important slide today, I think, is the one about religious perspectives. And then I'm going to take a closer look at Christianity and Islam and how they relate to each other, where they agree and where they disagree, and I've got some reading material for you as well. So me. Professionally, I'm a chartered accountant and chartered tax advisor. I retired about 10 years ago, but I spent all my professional career giving tax advice, apart from a year as a teacher. I've lived in Manchester since I was less than 2 years old, having been originally born in Pakistan. And I went from the slums of Moss Side in Manchester to Clare College, Cambridge. So it's an interesting life journey. And there's a lot more about me on my website, mohammedamin.com. And the main reason for having the URL on there is not just so that you can find out more about me, but because this talk, very likely, and lots of other talks that I have done are on the website, as well as lots of other writing about religion, including one document called Triangulating the Abrahamic Faiths, which I'm going to mention later on. So, religious perspectives, different ways of thinking about religion. And there are two fundamentally different ways. The academic way, in terms of advancing human knowledge, is crystal clear. God is something that you study in terms of how people think about God. What does God mean to them? But nothing in the academic study of religion permits any form of divine intervention. If a religious text predicts a real life event accurately and clearly enough so you can be sure that this text is talking about this event, that tells you straight away this text must have been written after the event, because human beings cannot tell the future. That academic perspective, of course, comes very naturally to people who are atheists, who don't believe in God's existence anyway. The other fundamentally different perspective is that of somebody who actually does believe that God exists, as I do, who does believe that God can tell human beings about the future, who does believe that God can actually communicate religious texts to people. And the challenge for a religiously believing person is, if they want to engage in an academic debate or with somebody who is an academic, they really have to force themselves to segment their brain, switch off all the believing bit, and concentrate purely on academic arguments. And if they can't do that, you end up trying to have a dialogue of the deaf. So it's really important, if somebody is talking about religion, to ask yourself the question, is this person speaking from the perspective of the believer, or are they speaking from an academic perspective? Because they are two fundamentally incompatible and totally different ways of looking at the world and looking at history. So, from an academic perspective, a very short bit of history. And today's talk is about Christianity and Islam, but it's impossible to talk in a historical sense about Christianity and Islam without talking about Judaism. And of course, the religious texts of both Christians and Muslims have a great deal to say about Jews and Judaism anyway. And you have to think about all three of them together, although our focus today will be Christianity and Islam. And I want you to take you back to the world as it was in about 600 AD, the life of the prophet. And we forget that at that time, the Middle East was overwhelmingly Christian. So we've got some modern sort of geographical, political boundaries in the white lines. But just think of the area. It was, by then, massively Christian. The Holy Roman Empire had converted to Christianity under Constantine, but there were also very major Jewish communities in places that we now call Iraq, Mesopotamia, and something which is often forgotten, in the Yemen. There was actually a Jewish kingdom in the 500s in Yemen, which ended up being destroyed they got into a war with the Ethiopians and lost. And the Ethiopians, of course, were and still are Christians. And I put yellow dots for Jerusalem and for Mecca and Medina, because to remind you how close these places are to each other. And the fact that Medina and Mecca were surrounded by Christians and Jews, and there were major Jewish presences in Medina in particular. So let's move away now slightly from the historical perspective and ask people, or take a closer look at what people actually believe. And I mentioned this article on my website, Triangulating the Abrahamic Faiths. And I wrote this after my first visit to Lambeth Palace, where a very senior Christian cleric, not the Archbishop of Canterbury, but somebody very senior who worked for him, showed me around Lambeth Palace and bought me lunch. And while we were having lunch, he said something that absolutely shocked me. You know what it's like when you know something for definite and somebody says the exact opposite, how much of a shock it is. And what this guy said to me was that Christianity and Judaism are very close to each other, but Islam is a very, very different religion. And when you have no religious credentials at all, and the person you're talking to is a senior Anglican cleric, and he's just bought you lunch, you don't get into a fight with them. It just doesn't make sense. It's rude. But I went away from that lunch determined to write a refutation of what he'd said, which totally contradicted what I believed. It took me about a year to produce a handwritten draft, and another year before I got around to typing it and publishing it on my website, but it's there on the website. And the message is summarized very clearly in this diagram. This is how I see it. Judaism and Islam are very close to each other, while Christianity is a long way away from both, but actually closer to Islam than it is to Judaism. But today, because we're not talking about Judaism, we're not going to get into more detail about that, so we're going to talk only about how Christianity and Islam relate to each other. But if you go to my website, you'll find this article from the home page, and you can read it. And I can understand why he had that view. If we look at religious texts, every Christian carries around with him the religious scriptures of the Jewish faith. The Old Testament, what we call the Old Testament, which Jews call the Tanakh, the Torah, the Nebiim, and the Ketubim, the law, the prophets, and the writings, is exactly the same text as the Old Testament. Different order. So the last book of, well, who can tell me the last book of the Old Testament in a Christian Bible? Anybody? Nope. It's the name of probably my favorite sort of Old Testament prophet, Malachi, faithful messenger. It also gets a mention in a novel by Kurt Vonnegut, The Sirens of Titan, and a song by Al Stewart. That's the last book of the Old Testament in the Christian Bible. It is not the last book of a set of Jewish scriptures. If you go and get the Holy Scriptures according to the Masoretic text, which is the standard English language translation of the Jewish scriptures, Malachi comes somewhere near the middle, because it's the law, the first 5 books, and then the prophets, and then the writings come at the end. But it is the same set of books. I've counted them. So there's no overlap between Christian and Jewish scriptures in terms of pages of text with the Quran at all. Complete non-overlap. So I can understand his view. to some extent. And if we look at prophets, again, in blue, we've got some of the prophets mentioned in the Old Testament, not all of them. Some very famous ones and some much less famous ones, like Malachi, for example, Haggai, Obadiah. On a good day, I can get the 12 minor prophets, but I'm not going to try it today. And then, of course, you get Christianity and you add Jesus. Although Christians don't think of Jesus as a prophet. We're going to look later on at what Christians do think about Jesus. And then you get Islam. If you go to the Quran, one of the things that surprises many people is the Quran actually gives lots of coverage to Adam, Noah, Abraham, Moses, and Joseph. The story of Joseph is all there in the Quran. The person mentioned by name more than any other person in the Quran is actually Moses, followed by Abraham, and followed by Jesus. Muhammad gets less mentions than any of them. And then in the Quran, you have Muhammad, but you also have various other prophets that you won't have heard of who get much smaller mentions, but they do get mentions in the Quran along with others. So a sort of overlap, but again, quite different. So moving now, leaving Judaism to one side, just concentrating on Christianity and Islam, where do they overlap and where do they differ? Well, they have a lot in common. They are talking about the same God. One of the things that occasionally surprises me is when you get some extreme American evangelicals who know next to nothing about anything other than their narrow bit of Christianity, who think that Muslims worship a totally different God than the God that they worship. If you want to know the correct answer, go and ask the Pope or the Archbishop of Canterbury. It's crystal clear that Muslims and Christians, when they talk about God, are talking about the very same being. And that's not just because there's one God. Even Hinduism is a very complicated religion which either has hundreds of millions of gods or has one, with all the other gods being a sort of manifestation of Brahma. But the one thing is quite clear, is that when you look at the beliefs of Hinduism, even if there was only sort of one God in Hinduism, they would be talking about a different God than what Jews, Christians and Muslims are talking about. But Christians and Muslims and Jews, when they talk about God, are talking about the very same God. Again, different from Jupiter or Zeus or Athena or Odin. Angels, various historical stories, heaven and hell. Fascinating one is the virgin birth. Muslims believe literally in the story of the virgin birth. Surprisingly, more and more Christians, including priests sometimes, don't actually believe that the virgin birth is literally true. And I think there will eventually be a crossover point where there are actually more than half the people in the world who believe in the virgin birth will be because they're Muslims rather than because they're Christians. So where do they differ, which is actually more interesting? And they are very fundamental differences. The nature of Jesus. Now, if you look at the history of Christianity, for hundreds of years, there were major internal conflicts in Christianity about the nature of Jesus. Was he all God? Was he all man? Was he man sometimes and God sometimes, or God and man all the time at the same time? Very complicated debates. Islam has a very crystal clear view. The path to how you are saved, the crucifixion, and something which I call religious exclusivity. We'll look at all of these very quickly. And when I talk about Christianity, because there are so many different Christian sects, just as there are so many different Muslim sects, you have to be clear what you mean. And for today's purposes, Christianity means Roman Catholicism. So if there's any differences in view between Roman Catholicism and Anglicanism or any other religious group, I'm talking about Roman Catholicism for two reasons. One, they're the biggest religious Christian group by far, and secondly, it's easy to find out what Roman Catholics believe. You go to the Vatican website and you can look it up. And this is what the Roman Catholic Church says about Jesus. That Jesus was the Son of God, and it's quite clear he was divine. Through him all things were made. That's the attribute of a God. The Muslim perspective is fundamentally different. And the best way to put this is that even though Jesus had a virgin birth, and I certainly didn't, Jesus was no more divine than me or any of you. It's as basic as that. Jesus was a man. Jesus worshipped God and never wanted anybody to worship him. Fundamentally different perspective from Roman Catholicism. Salvation. What actually gets you into heaven? And the fundamental Christian Roman Catholic doctrine is that what gets you into heaven is not the act of being good, although clearly the church does want you to be good. You get into heaven because Jesus died for you. It's as basic as that. And that's what this language is telling us. The Muslim perspective is, again, completely different. On the day of judgment, every one of us will stand there before God with a reckoning. What did you do right in your life? What did you do wrong in your life? God will assess that and give you either a tick or a cross. And nothing that anybody else does makes the slightest difference to your outcome. The sort of shorthand way of saying that is that no soul will bear the burden of another soul, which is a different way that this first part of the verse is often translated. Fundamental difference in perspective between Christianity and Islam. The crucifixion. The Quran does not believe that Jesus died on the cross. Muslims have speculated for 1400 years about what did happen, and you get alternative theories and guesses. Was there a last-minute substitution? Did God confuse the people who were trying to crucify Jesus? But the Quran is quite categorical, saying that they did not succeed in crucifying him. More importantly, and while the Catholic Church now doesn't go around pushing this too hard because it's a doctrine that can upset a lot of people, the fundamental Christian Catholic doctrine is that there is no salvation outside the church. In other words, provided you've had the opportunity to understand Christianity and to know about Christianity and to join the church, if you reject that, if you're not a believer, you've had it. The Quran is quite different. You don't have to be a Muslim to go to heaven. And there are plenty of extremist Muslims who will disagree with this. The people at ISIS who go around killing non-Muslims, they also kill any Muslim that they categorize as a non-Muslim. So they say to Shias, you're not a Muslim, we're going to kill you too. They believe that you have to be a Muslim to go to heaven. But that isn't what God himself says in the Quran. The first part of this verse is about Muslims, those who believe in this divine writ, but then Jews, Christians, and Sabaeans, who are a long-lost religious group from the Middle East, provided that they do behave well, provided they believe in God, they too can go to heaven. It's a fundamental difference in perspective from Catholicism. I promise you some reading material. There's no better way to understand Christianity than to actually read the Bible. In my 20s, I literally read it from the first verse of Genesis to the last verse of Revelation. And it was a real eye-opener, in particular the Old Testament, because I realized that in all modern sort of culture, God is the God of the Old Testament is severely misrepresented, because you get the impression that the only thing that the Old Testament God is interested in is smiting people. He's just waiting for you to do something wrong, then he hits you on the head and smites you. And if you read the Old Testament and you read what it has to say about God's anguish as he pours his generosity on the children of Israel and how they misbehave time and time again, you realize that the image of God in modern popular culture is just fundamentally wrong. But there's no substitute for reading this material by yourself, and not just cherry-picking the sort of exciting bits, the Israelites getting out of Egypt, but reading all of it. And if you want the academic historical understanding of the Bible, this short book by Robin Lane Fox is brilliant. I'm not going to go into the details now about the different bits of the Old Testament and how they were put together, but it's all covered there. Quran, again, if you want to understand Islam, read the Quran. And it is perfectly readable. And the one, if you've never read the Quran, the place to start is this modern translation by Abdul Halim, done in 2006. You literally can open it at the beginning and just keep reading until you get to the end. Not too many footnotes, very modern English, very comprehensible. But if you want to do research and studying, then I recommend the study Quran. If you're interested in the history, Tom Holland's book, In the Shadow of the Sword, incredibly readable. The first half is not about Islam at all. It's about the Eastern Roman Empire, a part of history that most of us never cover, because even if we do ancient history, we tend to do Western Rome. The Western Roman Empire, I tend to give up around about the time of Nero anyway. So strongly recommend that. Very, very readable book. And this 700-page blockbuster by Hans Kung, one of the world's leading Roman Catholic theologians. The reason I recommend that book is that when a Muslim says nice things about Islam, well, you'd expect Muslims to say nice things about Islam. But when a Roman Catholic says nice things about Islam, it's worth paying some attention to it. And this recent book by Reza Aslan about the historical Jesus from a Muslim perspective, again, great read. So with that, over to you for questions.